In a way, my presentation builds on what other people have already said, and there's been some kind of cross-referencing between some of the presentations already. I'm really happy about that, because in a way it makes what I have to say easier, and I can concentrate on some of the bits that, additional bits that I wanted to introduce. First of all, I will just talk about some of the basic assumptions which have gone into designing the idea of caste discrimination legislation in Britain. And I'll also sort of do a rough chronology together with a sort of brief summary of the content of the legislation that we have currently, and then I want to go into go more deeply into some of the presuppositions which have been informing the caste discrimination legislation, and those include the idea that caste is self-evidently immoral as an institution, the link between caste and race, which to a certain extent Marianne has already referred to, and the idea of the caste system, which in a way all the presentations have focused on. So probably I deserve probably the least time on that. And I want to conclude by saying that, as Duncan also has briefly mentioned, that this core idea of a research program, I don't think we can really understand what's happening in the debates around the caste system, including the framing of legislation around the idea of caste, unless we really get to the root of the Orientalist background, which is really, I think, lies at the core of the research program. And one can also add to that the theological dimension, which lies beneath that Orientalist program. Next, first slide, please. Thank you. The basic presuppositions which have gone into, or basic ideas which have gone into framing of the legislation in the UK. Indians have obviously a caste system, and that the caste system has been exported to the countries of the diaspora, and therefore we need legislation to include caste discrimination. But also there seems to be a parallel track going on at the moment where there are test cases going on, right? So there's an attempt to also bring test litigation in order to establish that the existing framework of anti-discrimination law already provides against caste discrimination, and a lot of that is of course done by reference to both the EU legislation, the Race Directive, and the international legislation on caste, which is the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. As I said, I will discuss some of the issues relating to caste legislation and case law, and end with this idea that at the end of the day we need to go deeper into the theoretical framework which informs the kind of recurring notion of caste, and to enable it to survive, as Duncan has rightly said. So what about the caste legislation? Okay, we know, next slide please. We know that it's been brought into onto the statute books. I won't say into effect because it's not in effect yet. So it's brought in into the statute book through two main steps. The first of which was to ensure that there is inserted into the Equality Act of 2010 as part of the idea of race, caste. Right. So the caste becomes a part of the idea of race in the Equality Act 2010, and therefore it becomes a protected part of a protected characteristic, right? So these are the grounds upon which one can take legal action, and most of those are of course civil grounds of legal action, right? Of course you can have investigation, some sort of types of semi-public interest litigation and so on as well on the back of that. Now initially of course the then Labour government wasn't convinced about the evidence which lay behind the need to include this in the legislation. So what it did, it actually accepted. It was forced into a position where it had to accept that caste should be an aspect of race, but not having enough evidence. What it said is that we're going to commission a study, which study some people have already mentioned, the so-called NISA report, which was produced at a time when the government had already changed. Right? So in late 2010, there was a new government. There was a coalition government of the Liberals and Conservatives. In the summer of 2010, and so the scenario, in a way, the political backdrop changed a little bit. Now, of course, there remain questions about the what the content of the NISA report. To what extent does it actually establish that there is caste discrimination on the ground in Britain, right? And some people have already observed that actually what it does is to relate stories about, again, endogamous practices, right? Or practices which are linked to the assumed idea endogamy, and there are issues to do with the entry to temples and that sort of thing, right? Those are issues which actually ordinarily wouldn't come within the scope of the legislation anyway. So then one is asking, well, what is the evidence base that we are framing this legislation on? Okay, but that didn't actually stop the advocates of the caste discrimination legislation to press on. Because what had happened in 2010 is that the Minister of State was given a power to effect the clause of caste. It wasn't brought in immediately, right? There was a permissive power, or the power was given to the minister to bring it into effect by through an order, right? Which means that it would basically be a ministerial decision, right? So highly discretionary ministerial decision, which would also include the enactment of an order in council, right? Which would make sure that the details of how caste is to become part of the Equality Act would in which that would be enumerated. So it would be sort of outside parliamentary process, well, it would be a sort of sanction which is given by parliamentary process, but there wouldn't be necessarily a further parliamentary process which would go into it. Not that I'm very impressed by the kind of parliamentary process which has attended the insertion of the idea of caste into the legislation. So perhaps there's not a lot to be said there. Anyway, in 2013. Please, next slide, please. In 2013, we get the next stage of the enactment of caste as an aspect of race, which was that those who were pressing originally for including caste as an aspect of race in the 2010 legislation now wanted an obligation to be imposed on the minister to introduce caste as an aspect of race, right? To actually effect it. It was already on the statute book, but they wanted an obligation, not just a mere power vested in the minister, right? But for the minister to be obliged to. So there was a key change in the wording, yeah, from the minister may to the minister must, yeah, ensure that that caste is effected, yeah, and brought into legal effect. As I said, the details were left to the order of the minister. Now, even at that time, actually, the government was in a way pushed into the corner. The government itself wasn't necessarily favouring this particular move, right? It was probably more against the move than the Labour government had been. But there were some political shenanigans in the background and so on, and eventually the government caved in and said, okay, what we'll do, we'll accept this change from may to must, right? But in a way, there was a sense that there's still not enough empirical evidence to say that there is, there is a real problem behind which, beyond for the solving of which we need to have legislation on the statute book. So the Equality and Human Rights Commission has been now tasked with an investigation, and people have already referred to the reports which the Equality and Human Rights Commission have issued. There are at least 2 reports now which were issued in March of this year, of 2014, which are they're easily available online. One can have a look at them, right? Now, of course, there were questions. I mean, among the people represented here, they raised many questions about the kind of commissioning process that went into it. Why is it that the academics which were commissioned to conduct the research already had some kind of bias towards the legislation, right? That the legislation be passed, that caste be included as an aspect of race, and so on. So that raises questions about, well, how sort of objective or how sort of neutral, would they be when they're examining the evidence with respect to the issue. So one of the things that's remarkable, and I think other people have already pointed to that, is that the report avoids defining caste precisely, right? And in a way that goes into the kind of very incoherent nature which has attended all the discussions on caste so far. Everybody knows that caste is there, that there is a caste system, but nobody can really define it very well. And of course, as somebody already pointed out today, if you're going to have a legal definition on caste, right, do you not need precision? Or are you going to leave it to the judges? And obviously there is some body of opinion which says, well, there are other things which are left to judges. Why don't we just leave the idea of caste to the judges as well? Good luck to the judges, I say, right? What about the actual implementation of the legislation? Answer is we don't know exactly when it's going to be brought into force. I don't know if anybody here has better information about that. Perhaps you can share it. Next slide, please. Yeah. Oh, thanks. I mean, the evidence that I've looked at so far seems to me to indicate that there is this prevailing idea that caste is a self-evidently immoral type of organization, right? Social organization. One doesn't need, in a way, research. Yeah, one doesn't need to discuss anything about its morality because it's sort of self-evident. Yeah, it's an obviously wrong or immoral institution, right? Nothing good can come out of it, kind of thing. So the sooner we're rid of it, the better. Now, it's already been mentioned, yeah, that there are certain groups who want to have the legislation on caste discrimination. They've been lobbying for it for some time. But of course, they have supporters in parliament, within academia, and so on. Just very briefly, I think it's kind of instructive just to compare the process of legislating on caste with the process of legislating on other dimensions of equality law, as we call it nowadays. Right? So if you take the example of religious discrimination, for instance, right, the main group which campaigned for inclusion of religion into the anti-discrimination law were Muslims, right? Because for long they had been aggrieved that, look, Jews are covered, yeah, under the original Race Relations Act. Sikhs are covered under the original Race Relations Act through test litigation and so on. So why not Muslims? And in fact, there was litigation which established exactly the opposite, that Muslims are not covered, right, by the then existing equality law. So for a long period of time, actually, Muslims were consistently campaigning, right, and eventually you saw in the inclusion of religion in one of the EU directives. You also saw in the inclusion of religion at a wider level, actually, in more areas of social life, in the Equality Act 2006, and then in the current Equality Act of 2010, you also see a kind of reiteration of the notion of religion as a protected characteristic, right? So you have a campaign by a kind of, right, a group which has, yeah, a kind of vested interest in bringing this because they feel unprotected under the current equality law. Now, the other thing, I mean, a linked point is that whenever let's say the idea of religion comes into the statute book, it's accompanied by a series of exceptions and exemptions, right? It is understood that even if you're bringing religious groups under the equality law, there's actually some areas of life where you'd want to allow the religious groups themselves to effectively, let's say, make distinctions on ground of religion, right? Because otherwise, you'd have chaos, right? Religious groups would actually not be able to self-organize. They wouldn't be able to make preferences on grounds of religion in order to carry on the religious life of their communities and so on, right? So what you find in legislation such as the Equality Act 2010 is an elaborate set of built-in exemption and exceptions for religious groups, right? But you don't see any of that kind of thing for caste, right? We don't know up to this day. Of course, now the socio-legal report, which has been produced under the auspices of the EHRC, does sort of moot the possibilities of various types of exemptions, right? But who's going to say who's going to say, well, this is the correct set of exemptions and so on? Particularly in a situation where we're saying, well, the idea of caste itself is coherent. So how do you make exemptions for an idea of for a legal idea which is in itself incoherent, right? So you get a kind of a double-layered problem there, right? And religion is not the only type of the protected characteristic where there is an inbuilt set of exemptions and exceptions. There's also you can find it for sex discrimination, disability, sexuality, and so on. Of course, as one of the interveners from the audience said earlier on, right? There is of course this idea of the link to Christian proselytization in India, right? Many people say that actually that's the real ground of action, right? That if it can be shown that the British Parliament respects the rights of Dalits by enacting a provision on caste discrimination, and by making it irrespective of whatever religious group one belongs to, right? Which is what we have at the moment. There are suggestions both in the explanatory notes in the Equality Act 2010 and also in some of the reports that have come out subsequently, that caste is not something which affects only Hindus, right? It may be something which is originated in Hinduism, but it's not just something which affects Hindus. So you get the British Parliament actually elongating or elaborating an idea of discrimination which is a pan-religious one, right? It may belong, it may be a property of South Asian groups generally, but it's not exclusive to one particular religious community, right? Which is where the link to proselytization kind of makes much more sense, because then you can see that, well, at the moment where Christian groups might be not entitled to certain reservations which are extended to otherwise to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, there can be the beginnings of the development of the argument that, well, the British Parliament is sees no discrimination, right, in terms of who can be discriminated against on grounds of caste, yeah, in terms of religious group. So why not the Indian government as well? So slowly you can see an argument developing there. And then, of course, the final link in the chain is that, well, then scheduled caste and scheduled tribe people will see more of an incentive to convert to Christianity once they see that they're also entitled to reservations. And I think that might be part of the kind of long game that the Christian churches and so on are playing, yeah, back in India. So to a certain extent, we can say that the game which is going on in Britain Britain is actually being used as a proxy, right, for a much larger game which is going on elsewhere in South Asia, and Nepal was also mentioned, about which I don't know much, right? Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. Now, of course, it's sort of, you speak to many of the organizations representing the various Indian communities in Britain, yeah, and they will tell you, yeah, that there was an avoidance of consultation, yeah, with them, right? Or if there was consultation, it's sort of half-hearted, sort of like listening but not really listening to our concerns and so on. If you look at the parliamentary procedure, you find that people like Lord Leicester saying that, well, actually we don't need to have research, right? Again, reinforcing this idea that, well, we kind of know about the caste system, we know that it's immoral, and we self-evidently need legislation on it. Yeah? Well, why do you need research, kind of thing? Notwithstanding the fact that the research that is out there actually isn't conclusive at all. It doesn't really show you anything at all. So it actually makes the case opposite to how somebody like Lord Leicester might wish it to be. You also get the misrepresentation of a report like the NISA report, right, where Lord Avery sort of implies in questions that he asks of the minister, doesn't it show, isn't it conclusive evidence that there is discrimination out there, sort of thing. So there are attempts to kind of misrepresent the contents or the conclusions that can be drawn from these reports. Then you get statements by other sort of spokespersons or MPs, yeah, who say, well, even a single case of discrimination it should be enough to act, kind of thing. And then you have this very ironic statement by John Ashworth. I'm sure it's very sincerely held, right? Where John Ashworth MP is one of the MPs in Leicester, who says that, well, in all my time as an MP, I've never seen a case of caste discrimination, right? And what does one do with that kind of evidence? Is there any place for it in the wider discussions around the propriety of having discrimination on grounds of caste? Of course, it's very important that it's Leicester, right? Because Leicester has something like 6 times the South Asian population of. If you take the UK average, it's actually 6 times the population that exists in the UK as a whole. So pretty significant, I would say. It was already mentioned earlier on. People like Lord Harris were sort of giving figures of 500,000 or so Dalits who exist in Britain. Yeah, it's not clear what the provenance of these figures is, but somehow the ideas have stuck. Yeah, other people like Lord Avery have given lesser figures, but it doesn't seem to matter sort of where these figures are, what their origin is. Sort of again, it goes to kind of reinforcing the idea that, well, whatever evidence is there, it doesn't really matter, because we know that caste is an immoral system anyway at the end of the day. Just next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. Now, in Marian's presentation, Marian, you made some really, really interesting links to the Orientalist literature, right? And you also showed the intimate connection between the idea of caste and race, right? But what's really interesting, or another dimension which is interesting, is that this linkage between caste and race is actually a persistent one, right? And it lasts well into like the 2010s, if you like, right? That we have this close connection between the idea of caste and the idea of race. And of course, I would like to work more on this, right? And try to be, sort of extending Marian's work, try to extend the idea more into the contemporary period, and try to show that actually there's a theoretical continuity, yeah, between the old linkages which were Orientalists made between race and caste, and the currently sort of applicable ones, right? And there are various bits of evidence for that, right? If you look at the attempt which was made in the World Conference 2001 to insert caste as an aspect of racial discrimination, the continued attempts both before the 2001 conference and since then, right, through the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, similar questions have been raised there, and in fact the committee accepts that descent-based discrimination includes caste-based discrimination, right, which is specifically against the position of the Indian government. Right? Then you have case law, like the most prominent case is of course the JFS case, right, which was brought against the decision of a school to refuse admission, right, to a child whose mum was Jewish by conversion, right, Because the traditional policy which schools like the JFS had employed was to say that, following on from the chief rabbi's position, to say that, well, only those can be considered Jews who are also born of a Jewish mother, right? Who is not a convert. So actually the House of Lords, it's the Supreme Court by majority, I'm showing my age, yeah, the Supreme Court by majority says, actually that amounts to discrimination on grounds of ethnic origin, and therefore amounts to racial discrimination, right? Having such a policy, which has had a huge impact on the Jewish community, right? And the internal sort of fissures within the Jewish community have if anything, but widened, right? But important, I think, for our purposes, is just to notice the idea that there is a kind of activism within the judiciary which is more than happy to extend the ambit of certain legislation which has been there, but to change the traditional understanding that that legislation has been created. Right? And there were accusations against the judgment of the majority in the Supreme Court of the JFS case, right? To say that, well, actually, it sounds like they're employing a definition based of religiosity which is based on Christianity and not Judaism, right? So you see a kind of similar type of, in a way, secularized proselytizing campaign going on against the Jewish community as well, which is remarkable. The next case we have is the Turkey case, right? Now the Turkey is, of course, at a much lower level. It's the employment tribunal case, and the tribunal actually had to go into a preliminary hearing about whether or not caste could be an aspect of racial discrimination, right? So it was, because it was contended for that, a very similar, the Devyani case was mentioned earlier, right? The Devyani Khobragade case in the United States, in New York, right? Similar type of scenario there, right? So you have the Indian expatriate couple who are employing an Indian servant, right? Servant goes along to the anti-trafficking unit and says, well, actually, I've been abused and so on, racial discrimination, unpaid wages, and a whole sort of other claims. But on the back of that, as I said, as a preliminary issue, so as a late claim, as part of an add-on to the existing legal claims, there was also a claim of caste discrimination, right? So then the judge had to decide, well, is it admissible for a claim of caste discrimination to be added to the basic claim, which was a claim of racial discrimination, in among other claims. And in fact, it's very interesting that the judge says, well, if you look at the EU directive on race, which applies in the UK as well, right? If you look at the EU directive on race, that was meant to incorporate into the EU legal order the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has a bit on dissent, right? It includes dissent as part of the overall definition of racial discrimination. And therefore, what we can do is we can elaborate on that and add dissent to our Equality Act of 2010, and therefore we can also include caste as part of dissent. Right? So there's a kind of multi-layered argument which the judge goes through, and basically accepts the idea that caste discrimination claims can already be brought under the Equality Act of 2010. Right? So regardless of whether or not the Equality Act has actually been brought into force, that the caste provision has been brought into force, or brought into effect, you already have case law which admits the possibility in principle that it could be done. Right? So again, as I started off explaining, right? Again, you can see the very intimate linkage, right? At least in some sense, between the idea of caste and race. And as I said, we have to kind of do more work, I think, in particular to link it to the Orientalist theory and to see how, even though the idea of caste is incoherent, it still makes sense that it can be a part of racial discrimination, right? And how is that? Why is that? Sort of thing. Yeah, next slide, thanks, yeah. So, now, of course, there's a bit of lack of clarity. I think, Duncan, you also sort of alluded to it quite quickly, yeah? What are we really talking about here? Are we talking about caste? Are we talking about caste system? Are we talking about caste discrimination? What's the actual target point, right? And of course, at the very basic level, we don't know what caste is. Right? The explanatory, as I said, the explanatory notes to the 2010 Act do indicate both references to Jati, Varna, and Biradari. So it seems like all of them constitute caste, right? Or any of them at any particular point in time, right? And it also says, very interestingly, as I mentioned earlier, that it's not restricted to any particular religious group, right? So it could be Christians, Jewish Indians, Jewish Hindus, whoever, right? Who would be potential sort of targets of litigation on this. this. David, you're here. David Keane, in your 2007 book, you say, well, caste is a unique feature of Hindu religion, which of course contradicts what the explanatory notes in the legislation say, right? Our socio-legal report, which has been issued by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, says, well, there are dangers in adopting too precise or too broad a legal definition of caste. So here, of course, we have a kind of a virtue being made out of the lack of precision, right? Which is, I think, not really satisfactory for a legal definition to be. Yeah, David, again, in your 2000 books, you kind of, in a way, give the game away by saying, well, we can't really define this thing, whatever it is, right? So everybody talks about it, but we can't really define it. So, and we have various such, I think, I mean, recently, I think Annapurna, David, and you with Lord Leicester, you issued a statement, right? I forget the name of the trust that it was done under, right? But again, I think you reiterate the idea that it's not necessary to have a precise definition of caste, right? Because if the legislation can define Sikhs, right, or Jews, right? If the judges can cope with that, then we also don't need a definition of caste. Right? All right. So either it's not necessary to define it too precisely, or it's not necessary to have a definition at all. Okay, so as I started to say at the beginning, right, we have definite direct links, which enable us to make connections between what's going on in contemporary Britain and the Orientalist background to the caste theories and theories about the caste system, right? Now, I can't remember exactly who it was who talked about Brahmins. I think Martin, it was you, right, in particular, right, who talked about the situation of Brahmins as, you know, keeping their followers in ignorance, as purveyors of a false religion called Hinduism and so on. And of course, they're preventing people from converting to the real revelation, or the more authentic, like upgraded version, which the European Aryans have sort of introduced to them, which is Christianity, right? And this is, of course, backed up by the Aryan intrusion theory, and the idea that India's population is composed of different races, dominant and subordinate. And of course, we have this implicit idea, which is, of course, has its root in Christian theology, right? Which is that caste, as a system which is mandated by the religion of the Indians, imposes an immoral system of obligation on them, right? And of course, it's notwithstanding, of course, we have all these theological and Orientalist accounts, but at the moment, what we have, as Duncan and others have said, is a kind of secularized theorizing of the caste system, which actually directly depends on, it builds on the original Orientalist and Christian theological accounts. And just the last slide, Marianne already mentioned this, but I just wanted to remind you of these quotes, which really show you that even today, we have this sort of persisting what Balagangadhara refers to as colonial consciousness, right? That contemporary Indians have so much absorbed the colonial account, of their own society, that they don't have any problems in simply reiterating it as representing a real dimension of their societies, right? Rather than some kind of construction. And I just want to round off by saying that, and to tie up some of the discussions that happened before, I think we're in a serious problem, right? Because we don't yet have, I mean, this discussion has kind of constituted the beginnings of an attempt to say that, look, everything that we've been talking about is actually pulled into a particular direction because of the power of the theoretical framework, that core of the research program that Duncan talks about. So it pulls, it makes us see acts of violence or acts of endogamy and so on as if they reinforce our idea of the caste system, right? But they are not proofs of it at all, right? Because we presuppose those theories when we try to allocate these facts to a particular sort of explanatory schemas and so on, right? And that's exactly what you see happening in the enactment of the caste legislation as well. People just know that the Aryans were there, and they subordinated other people, and they created other races, and Hinduism is a corrupt religion. We know that, don't we? So, thanks very much.
Hello. Time for questions. Please keep them short and concise so everyone gets a chance here. And also introduce you.
Mukesh Naka from British Hindu Voice. Question for Duncan. You mentioned the statistics on the atrocities against Dalits. In academic terms, how would you say a figure is significant or not significant, purely for a layperson's understanding?
I didn't get the question. Significance.
I mean, you mentioned some figures.
Yeah.
And obviously, from your point of view, academically, they are not significant, or statistically speaking, they are not significant, and they don't tell the truth. Well, the allegation is not proven, basically. So, if it was to be made as a proven fact, statistical proven fact, what would be that figure, and what would be the criteria underlying that?
See, the kind of statements we make about caste violence, that it is rampant in India, that you will see everywhere if you go. There are also the statements made that a majority of that Brahmin men go around raping Dalit women, that if you see the number of crimes that's happening in India, usually it is the lower caste people who are at the receiving end. So that is the kind of statements we make, from the popular literature to the very serious, quote-unquote, serious literature about caste system, which demands that when we go down to the real data and analyze the data, we have some substantial figure to show that we can't talk in terms of, see, this is the, if you ask me how many rapes should happen to say that there is caste violence also involves rape in it, that will become very obscene discussion. That is not the discussion. But if you want to say that low caste people are always at the receiving end in the violence that happens in India, then we really need some substantial figures. We cannot take 0.5% of the total violence that happens in India, happening against 16% population of India, and say that this 0.5% of violence shows that there is caste system in India, and it leads to and results in a serious kind of violence. So that is the problem, because the same figure that I showed you also shows that the murders based on love and sexual issues is way more than that. If at all we have to generalize, then we have to say that sex and love relationship based violence is more rampant in India than caste based violence. But we don't say those kind of things. We don't say that the property and fight for property is so integral part of Indian culture, and see the number of murders that has happened in India shows that it is really basic to it. We don't talk in those terms. But when it comes to caste issues, no matter how small the figure that we have, even if it is just 0.5% of the total murders and zero culpable homicides, even then we go on to make a generalized, say that, yeah, caste system and violence are same.
I was going to ask well, maybe it's not a probably an appropriate question at the moment, but in the sense, with your field work that you've done on caste and violence and so on, what would be a productive way or an effective way of trying to deal with that?
Deal with?
In India, for example.
Deal with what?
With the violence and the caste issues that you outline. How is the rest of society, how could they potentially deal with it to minimize it or even eliminate it? Have you got any thoughts?
The right person to answer this question, because I'm not working on kind of issues which will talk about, give policy suggestions to how to redress violence in India. What I can show is this, based on my research and the research of the research group that I'm part of, I can show that there are problems in India. Of course, those even 0.5% of murders or rapes that are happening are real. Let's not disagree with that fact, that figure. But if we have a fault theories and wrong theories and go and try to solve it, then it looks like we are in this kind of situation that, to take an example that Balagangadhar takes always. You go to a doctor with minor headache and he has some really bad theories about what headache is, and he starts giving you chemotherapy. So what happens at the end of the day then? Instead of curing your chemotherapy or headache, it is going to cause serious damage to you. That is what we are doing in India. There is real problem in India. Let's accept, at the moment at least, let's not disagree with that. There is problem in India. But our wrong theories and false understanding of Indian society, Indian culture, is aggravating the problem rather than redressing the problem. That is the problem.
Bharti Taylor, I'm with the ACLC. Couple of things. Firstly, there was a mention of sort of three things that define the three basic principles of caste: endogamy, hierarchy, and caste violence. Now, talking specifically with the British issue in mind, here, my experience is I came to Britain as a 10-year-old. And in that time, up till today, I've seen that endogamy no longer applies. Firstly, there are marriages between whites and blacks and Indians, and then within ethnic groups and across ethnic groups. Hierarchy. I myself didn't know where in the hierarchy, that there was a hierarchy and that I had a place in it. I was just an Indian, and according to the majority population, I was a Paki, and that's the only hierarchy I knew. And then violence based on caste is something I have never come across, and I've lived in high Hindu areas, high Indian areas, and in areas away from high numbers of Indian population. So how can then people turn around and say caste discrimination or caste exists in Britain? So that was my sort of first observation for the afternoon sessions. The other issue was, I think you're quite right, that there is this perception and accepted, it is a prejudice held that Indians and Hindus discriminate on caste, to such an extent that in my work across Europe, I've found that in many countries, Hinduism is not accepted as a major faith. It's not given the status of other major faiths. And the other bit of discrimination that comes in with that is we don't have the same rights as the citizens in other countries because of this. And I'm fairly sure this is discrimination based on the prejudices held that Indians discriminate on base of caste, so why should we treat them as equal? Coming to the legislation in Britain, I wanted to sort of raise this issue of legislation in India. Do you feel that the legislation in India has actually put caste in silos so that people can't climb out because they lose privileges? So the reservation has helped to solidify caste boundaries, and that legislation coming into Britain is going to do the same.
Yeah, a few things. First, I didn't say that those three issues, endogamy, hierarchy, etc., are properties of caste system. I said, when you talk about a system, the only way we can talk about system in a meaningful way is when we identify what are the properties that constitute a system, and there is no consensus on that. Yet, to make this discussion happen, we have to talk about at least some of those properties that majority of the scholars accept as basic to caste system. So, and I chose those three. So that is just a note. But your last question, yes, that is what we have found out so far, that more and more we apply our wrong theories of caste system, whether in the form of economic policies or legislations or the reservations and things like that. We are going to create the problems that we want to find solutions for. So we are creating discriminations and hatred in society that we really want to fight against. That is happening, yes. Reservation in India, instead of solving the problem, it has created the problem. There is a small popular survey that was going around. I never found the source of it. It said, because of the reservation in India, if you see over the last 50 years, what has happened is a majority of people who have come out of India for job in search of jobs are and now are at the top of the positions in various parts of the world are upper caste people, Brahmins. Which means what? Which means we have given incentive to some caste, say upper caste, to work hard and find better jobs, and incentives to some caste, so-called low caste, to stay back in India and do nothing basically. And we're giving incentive to them to not study, not understand anything, and just to stay on some charity money that the state gives. Yeah, that way we have created more problems than they were in the past. I think I've answered your questions.
Thank you. I would like to add the example of Shimuga now. Dalit organizations, they have weekly sessions to talk to the people, and they are encouraging Dalits to go and rape Brahmin women to break the caste system. So these things are very, very real today in India. It's going on a daily basis. They also advise to marry Brahmins to break it, but they say, go and rape them. And that's just one of the many examples of creation of hatred. Another example is the school. I have a friend who is here on a scholarship. She's not a Brahmin. She's she's a Rajput, so she's Kshatriya. She didn't get into the top institutions because she only had 96%. So, and to fill the quota of the Dalit students, they only have to have 33% to get in. And so her friend said, yeah, well, you should have had 99%. Don't whine. So that's why they flee also abroad, because they don't get opportunities. So that's discrimination.
I just wanted to comment that everyone is talking about more research, about more academic engagement, and I'm really worried about that whole aspect. Right, I recall Winston Churchill once said that the empires of the future will be the empires of the mind, and we've already got an example of how the Indian mind has been subverted from its natural trajectory that it was going along by the imposition of this notion that caste exists within Indians, so it has to be enshrined in the constitution, in the law, and everything else. When this whole caste debate started, the first thing I did was I contacted my son and I said, look, can you get a group of your youngsters together? Get them all as Indians together. There are a couple of things I want to establish for my own satisfaction. He got 18 friends together. They didn't know what the subject was about. And I said, it's about caste. This has been raised by Lord Harry's in the House of Parliament. And I showed them the video recording of it in the excerpts. And I said, what's your experience of being British Hindus in this country? And their response was, haven't you old people got anything better to do with your time? Okay, so we in this country, in 3 generations, have managed to get another Hindu generation who has managed to cast off that mental pollution of caste which India is still struggling with. And now my concern is that by continuously poring over this problem and picking at this wound in our psyche, are we going to actually exacerbate the problem in the minds of our younger children that actually your ancestors were like this? That's why all of this is going on, and that's why this problem has to be discussed ad nauseum to find a solution for it. My bigger concern is what are we doing to protect our next generation, our current generation of youngsters, from this polluting influence, this assault on their psyche?
Well, a short answer to that would be that these youngsters are also part of European society. And actually, European society has some of the deepest nightmares about Indians in their midst, right? That's what the story of the caste legislation teaches you. So these youngsters will have to be mentally fit enough to be able to fight that, right? And they have to be able to argue their way through it on an intellectual level, not having fist fights and so on, right? And we need to be able to correct, right? We need to be able to tell Europeans what their theoretical presuppositions have been, right? And that we can see through them, right? And we don't buy them anymore.
So do we talk more about the more rampant problem of Christian priests and the abuse that they're perpetrating, have perpetrated? Statistically, that is so much more significant than the 0.5% in India. Is this the battleground that we need to get ready to go on to and say, hang on a minute, review your own house, put that in order, and
Yeah, well, that might work as an argument as well, but in a way one has to prepare for both dimensions, right? Because life is situation specific. You will, in certain situations, you will have to respond to allegations. You know, your people discriminate on grounds of caste, don't they? I'm sure your kids are getting that all the time. You know, on some level, somebody's nodding behind you, right? So how do you respond to that? You know, at the moment, I can see Hindus being able to, or Indians generally, being able to respond in a number of ways, which all actually accept the basic idea that a caste system exists in India and has existed for aeons, right? So either Hindus can say, well, it's no longer like that. It may have been once upon a time, but it's no longer like that. Or you can say, which hardly anybody says nowadays, which is that no, caste is actually, we do have a caste system, but it's the most fantastic thing that was ever invented, right? Yeah, there is a third one which I can't exactly remember, but basically it still goes into reinforcing, you know, oh yeah, the Gandhi type of response. Once it was good, now it's degraded, right? So you can have all these responses basically reinforce the idea that we have a caste system, right? And we are still actually apologetic for it. Maybe the middle response kind of goes the other way and say, no, it was the best thing since sliced bread, which is equally an unreasonable response, and still accepts the presupposition of a caste system. So, you know, so what do we do beyond that? That's the question, and that's an intellectual problem.
I'm really hoping that somehow we'll get a consensus to what the next action should be.
Just to add a couple of things more, when I say use the word research, or when I should rather say we use the word research, it's not so much about doing postdoctorate in University of Pardubice. It is about thinking about what we are, our culture is, our past is, etc. And realizing to ourselves and to able to explain it to our younger generation. Some of the questions, like when our younger ones, our kids or younger brothers or sisters are hesitant to talk about, let's say, Ganapati or Shiva, or worried whether we wrote Kama Sutra, whether a Hindu Rishi wrote Kama Sutra ever, and did he say that you should go and have sex, or Krishna did have sex with 16,000 women. These kind of questions, when they embarrass us, we should learn to see what they are and understand it, and deal with it in such a way that, let's say, a person of our age 1,000 years ago dealt with it as though it's a beautiful culture, that it had developed a way of living, of understanding a world and its culture, etc. That is what we have to figure out, and that can be done no matter where we are, whether we can sit here or sit in a home where we're cooking or we are doing research in a university.
Okay, thanks. 2 quick questions and then we break. Yeah. So I'll take the questions together and then we answer.
This whole caste debate has been the classic cliche, don't let facts get in the way of a good story. The question here is, I've looked at many Indian judgments and the constitution, things like that. I've not been able to find a definition either the Supreme Court has made or anybody's made. So I don't even know what the Indians are calling caste. What is it they're basing their systems on? Have you any idea? And it seems here, so I said to the English, so you're going around, as you did in the colonies, going around defining other communities again. And if the Indians can't define it, what is it that we're talking about? And I think in a way you allude to it. Is there a definition that the Constitution uses or the Supreme Court uses?
I don't think I know.
Just hold your answer a second.
Yeah, just to introduce myself. So Pranam Nafani, chair of the City Hindus Network. So I work in law, but I work in tax law, so a slightly different area. But process is still important to all of us. So my question is, why do you think our community has been the subject of such a flawed legislative process? So one where the research that has been conducted has arguably been biased, where those conducting the research have had preconceptions, misconceptions, views that they've already held that have actually blatantly come out in the report. And you've got research. So last week, City Hindus Network had an event on the caste legislation, and we had a pro-legislation campaigner there who was born and brought up in India, and he asserted to me that in the UK, kids get asked what caste they are in school. And I said, well, hold on, I was born and brought up here. I've been to school here all my life, and not one person in my life has ever asked me what caste I am. So who are you to come from a different country and tell me how the schooling system works here? Yet those sort of assertions are reflected in the reports, are taken as fact. So why do you think our community has been the subject of such a flawed process?